1945, May 8th. Over 400,000 German soldiers surrendered to American forces, expecting torture, starvation, and death, but instead they were served white bread, real coffee, and chocolate bars on their first day in captivity. Within months, these starving men who had been told America was a weak, crumbling nation were gaining weight, earning wages, and watching Hollywood movies in POW camp theaters while their families back home were eating grass and tree bark to survive. But here's what nobody talks about. If America treated them so well, why did 9,000 of these German soldiers choose to never see their families or homeland again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was finally over. Germany lay in ruins. Every major city had been bombed into piles of broken concrete and twisted metal. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, all of them looked like the surface of the moon. Factories that once built tanks and airplanes were now just empty shells with no roofs. Train stations had no trains. Bridges had collapsed into rivers. Millions of people had no homes to return to. The German economy had completely collapsed. Money was worthless. A wheelbarrow full of cash couldn't buy a loaf of bread because there was no bread to buy. Farmers had no seeds to plant. Stores had empty shelves. Children went to bed hungry every single night. Mothers boiled grass and tree bark to make soup that had no nutrition but at least filled empty stomachs for a few hours. For 12 years, the Nazi government had controlled everything Germans saw, read, and heard. Radio broadcasts told them that Germany was the master race, destined to rule the world. Newspapers showed pictures of German soldiers marching victoriously through conquered cities. Propaganda films in movie theaters portrayed Americans as weak, lazy people controlled by Jewish bankers. The Nazis said American society was falling apart because of racial mixing. They said American soldiers had no fighting spirit and would run away at the first sign of real combat. They said America's cities were filled with crime and poverty while Americans ate rotten food and lived in slums. German soldiers believed these lies because they had never been told anything different. Young men like Klaus, a 20-year-old farm boy from the green hills of Bavaria, grew up hearing these stories. He joined the Wehrmacht at 17 because every boy his age did. He learned to march, to shoot, to follow orders without question. He believed Germany would win because his officers told him so every single day. Werner was 28 and had worked in a steel factory in Essen before the war. He had a wife and a baby daughter. He joined the army because he had no choice. The government would have arrested him if he refused. He fought on the Eastern Front where he saw things that gave him nightmares. He watched friends die in the snow. He ate frozen bread so hard it cracked his teeth. He marched until his boots fell apart and his feet bled into the dirt. Friedrich was 35, an engineer from Dresden who designed parts for aircraft engines. He was smart and could do complex math in his head. He had studied at university and read books in 3 languages. But even Friedrich believed some of the propaganda because it was everywhere, all the time, impossible to escape. When his city was firebombed in February 1945 and turned into an ocean of fire that killed tens of thousands in a single night, he joined the army out of rage and desperation. By late April 1945, these 3 men and hundreds of thousands like them were retreating westward across Germany. They were starving and exhausted. Their uniforms were torn and filthy. Many had no weapons left. They had been marching for weeks with almost no food. Some men ate dandelions from the roadside. Others chewed on leather belts just to have something in their mouths. They slept in ditches and abandoned barns. Every day, more men simply sat down by the road and refused to walk another step. The German officers told them to keep fighting, to defend the fatherland to the last man. But everyone could see the truth now. American tanks rolled across the countryside like unstoppable metal monsters. American planes filled the sky in formations so large they blocked out the sun. The Americans had so many vehicles that their convoys stretched for miles. The Germans had horses pulling wooden carts. Klaus and Werner and Friedrich met near the Elbe River in early May. They were part of a large group of soldiers who had decided together to surrender to the Americans instead of the Russians. Everyone had heard terrible stories about Soviet prison camps in Siberia where German prisoners were worked to death in frozen forests. The Americans seemed like the safer choice, though no one knew what to expect. On May 8th, they walked toward American lines with their hands raised high above their heads. Klaus was terrified. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. Werner whispered prayers under his breath. Friedrich tried to stay calm, but his hands were shaking. They expected to be shot immediately, or beaten with rifle butts, or tied up and thrown into trucks bound for some nightmare camp where they would slowly starve to death. Instead, American military police wearing clean uniforms and helmets with white letters painted on them directed the Germans into organized lines. The MPs carried weapons but didn't point them at anyone. They looked bored, almost casual, like this was just another day at work. One MP was chewing gum. Another was smoking a cigarette and reading a newspaper. They weren't angry, they weren't screaming, they were just processing prisoners like clerks in an office. The Germans were searched quickly, but not roughly. They were checked for weapons and SS tattoos. A medic looked at each man for a few seconds, checking for obvious wounds or diseases. Then they were sprayed with white powder to kill lice. The powder smelled sharp and chemical, but it didn't hurt. They were given clean prisoner uniforms, not fancy, but not rags either. The fabric was intact, with no holes. Then came the first meal. Klaus stared at his metal tray in disbelief. There was white bread, actual white bread, soft and fresh. There was canned meat that smelled rich and salty. There was real coffee, hot and black and strong. Werner's hands trembled as he lifted the bread to his mouth. He bit into it, and tears ran down his dirty face. Friedrich ate slowly, carefully, afraid that eating too fast after weeks of starvation would make him sick. Klaus leaned close to Werner and whispered, "Is this a trick? Are they fattening us up before they kill us?" Werner didn't answer. He just kept eating, shoving food into his mouth like a starving animal. Around them, thousands of German prisoners did the same, eating in shocked silence, unable to believe what was happening. The next morning, Klaus woke up thinking the first meal had been a dream. But then breakfast arrived, and his mind struggled to understand what he was seeing. The American cooks served scrambled eggs made from yellow powder mixed with water, but they were real eggs that tasted rich and filling. There were strips of bacon, crispy and salty. There were oranges, bright orange spheres that Klaus had not seen since before the war started in 1939. There was fresh milk in glass bottles and more white bread with real butter. Werner picked up an orange and just held it in his hands, staring at it like it was a precious jewel. He hadn't tasted citrus fruit in over 6 years. The portions were enormous. Each man received more food on one metal tray than most German civilians had eaten in an entire week. Klaus ate until his stomach hurt, and there was still food left on his plate. He watched in amazement as some American guards scraped leftover food into trash bins. They were throwing away perfectly good bread. They were dumping half-eaten eggs into garbage cans like it meant nothing. Friedrich leaned over to Werner and said quietly, "They throw away more food than my entire family ate in a month." Within a few days, the prisoners were organized into a proper camp. The Americans had set up the facility in former German military barracks that had been cleaned and repaired. There were fences with guard towers, yes, but the barracks had roofs that didn't leak. There were beds with mattresses, not just wooden boards. There were latrines that actually worked with running water. Everything was organized with American efficiency that the Germans found both impressive and strange. Then the Red Cross packages started arriving. Klaus received a cardboard box with his name written on it in pencil. Inside were things he thought he would never see again. Chocolate bars wrapped in paper and foil, chewing gum in small packages, playing cards with pictures of American pinup girls, a small sewing kit with real thread and needles, bars of soap that smelled like flowers. Werner opened his chocolate bar slowly, broke off one small square, and let it melt on his tongue. The sweetness made him close his eyes and remember his daughter's face, wondering if she was still alive. After a week, the Americans assigned the prisoners to work details. This confused everyone. Work was expected, prisoners always worked, but the Americans paid them. Each man received scrip, special prison money that could be used at the camp canteen. The canteen sold cigarettes, candy, toothpaste, razor blades, and writing paper. Klaus bought a pencil and paper to write letters home. Werner bought cigarettes, even though he didn't smoke, planning to trade them for other things later. Friedrich bought a small notebook and started writing down everything he observed, keeping a careful diary of this strange experience. The work itself was nothing like the brutal forced labor the prisoners had expected. Some men worked in the camp kitchen, peeling potatoes and washing dishes. Others did maintenance, painting barracks and fixing fences. Some were assigned to nearby farms where American families needed help with planting and harvesting. The guards didn't beat anyone. The work shifts were 8 hours, not 14. There were breaks for water and rest. Men who got sick were sent to the camp hospital, where American doctors actually treated them with real medicine. One afternoon, a truck arrived at the camp and Klaus couldn't believe what he saw painted on its side. Coca-Cola! The red and white letters seemed to glow in the sunlight. The driver unloaded crates of glass bottles filled with dark, fizzy liquid. The camp canteen started selling Coca-Cola for 5 cents in scrip. Klaus used his wages to buy one bottle. He had never tasted anything like it in his entire life. It was sweet and bubbly and cold, so cold it made his teeth hurt. He drank it slowly, making it last as long as possible, thinking about how his little sister back home would never believe this story. The American guards were the strangest part of everything. They sat around reading comic books with colorful pictures of superheroes. They listened to jazz music on portable radios, music that the Nazis had banned as degenerate, but that sounded exciting and alive. The guards played baseball during their breaks, hitting a small white ball with wooden bats and running in circles. They seemed completely uninterested in Nazi ideology or politics or revenge. They just wanted to do their jobs and go home. Some of them were friendly, teaching the prisoners English words and laughing at their terrible pronunciation. Others ignored the prisoners completely, treating them like furniture. On Saturday nights, the Americans showed movies in the camp theater. Hollywood films projected on a white screen in a dark room. Klaus watched westerns with cowboys and Indians. Werner saw musicals with women in beautiful dresses singing and dancing. Friedrich watched a film showing American cities with tall buildings that touch the clouds, wide highways filled with cars, factories bigger than entire German towns. The movies showed supermarkets with shelves stacked to the ceiling with food. They showed ordinary American families who owned automobiles and lived in houses with electricity and indoor plumbing. They showed teenagers drinking milkshakes in chrome diners. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. At first, Klaus thought the movies were propaganda, fake images designed to trick them. But then he looked around at the camp, at the abundance of food, at the waste, at the casual wealth displayed everywhere. He started to realize something terrible. The movies weren't exaggerated. They might actually be showing normal American life. If this was true, then everything, absolutely everything he had been told about America was a complete lie. Werner said it out loud one night as they lay in their bunks. They weren't bombing us because they were desperate or struggling. They were bombing us because they could. Because they had so many planes and so many bombs that it cost them almost nothing. We never had a chance. November 1945 brought a day that changed everything for Klaus and thousands of other prisoners. The Americans announced they were celebrating something called Thanksgiving, a holiday the Germans had never heard of. The camp cooks had been preparing for days, working in shifts around the clock. On Thanksgiving morning, the smell of roasting meat filled the entire camp. It was a smell so rich and overwhelming that men stood outside their barracks just breathing it in, unable to believe what their noses were telling them. When the prisoners lined up for the meal, they saw tables covered with white cloths. This alone was shocking. Tablecloths for prisoners. Then came the food. Whole roasted turkeys, golden brown and glistening with fat. Mountains of mashed potatoes with rivers of brown gravy. Stuffing made with bread and herbs. Sweet potatoes covered in something sticky and sweet. Green beans. Dinner rolls so soft they felt like clouds. Cranberry sauce that was both tart and sweet at the same time. And then, after all of that, came dessert. Pumpkin pie with whipped cream on top. Klaus sat at the table with his hands shaking. Werner was crying again, tears dripping into his mashed potatoes. Friedrich just stared at his plate, unable to move. Around them, grown men were weeping openly. Some were laughing in a way that sounded almost crazy. Others ate in complete silence, chewing slowly, their eyes closed. An American chaplain stood up to speak. He was a captain with graying hair and a kind face. He said they were gathered to give thanks for peace, to be grateful the war was over, to pray for all the soldiers who would never come home, on both sides. He said he was thankful the prisoners were safe and being cared for. He talked about forgiveness and moving forward and building a better world. His words were translated into German by another prisoner who spoke both languages. Klaus felt something break inside his chest. It was a physical feeling, like a wall crumbling. He thought about everything he had been taught, the master race, German superiority, the weakness of America, the righteousness of their cause. Every single piece of it was a lie. They were not the master race. They had lost to a nation so powerful and so wealthy that it could feed its prisoners better than Germany had ever fed its own soldiers. The Americans were not weak. They had crossed an ocean, defeated Germany and Japan at the same time, and now they were serving turkey dinners to enemy prisoners while German children starved in the rubble of destroyed cities. Werner whispered across the table, "We were told we were fighting for survival, for our very existence. But look at this. They were never threatened. They were never hungry. They have so much they don't even know what to do with it all." His voice was bitter and sad and broken. Within weeks, the Americans started showing different kinds of films. These were not Hollywood movies. These were newsreels from concentration camps. Liberation footage from Dachau and Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. The prisoners were forced to watch. Many tried to look away. Some said it was propaganda, that the images were fake, that the Americans had staged it all. But others, like Friedrich, had heard whispers during the war, rumors about camps in the East, trains full of people who never came back, smoke from chimneys that never stopped. Friedrich sat in the dark theater and watched skeletons with human faces stare at cameras. He saw piles of bodies bulldozed into massive graves. He saw children with numbers tattooed on their arms. He saw gas chambers disguised as showers. He saw rooms full of human hair and eyeglasses and shoes. His engineer's mind tried to calculate the logistics, the scale, the systematic efficiency of it all. This was not random violence. This was industrial murder, planned and executed with German precision. That night, Friedrich couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk and thought about what his country had done. He had designed aircraft parts. Those aircraft had been used to bomb cities full of innocent people. He had contributed to the machine. He had been a small gear in a system of death. The shame was so heavy he could barely breathe. The Americans started offering education classes. Prisoners could attend lectures about democracy, about free markets, about individual rights and freedom of speech. Friedrich went to every class. He learned about the American Constitution, about checks and balances, about the separation of powers. He learned that Americans could criticize their own government without being arrested. He learned that multiple political parties competed in real elections. He learned that newspapers could print different opinions and argue with each other in public. He started writing in his diary every night. One entry said, "I fought for a system that destroyed my country and murdered millions of innocent people. The enemy I feared has fed me better than my own officers ever did. They have educated me and treated me with dignity. Everything I believed was backwards. Everything was a lie." Some prisoners were assigned to work on American farms outside the camp. Werner was sent to help a farmer plant winter wheat. The farmer was an older man with weathered hands and a sun-damaged face. He worked alongside Werner in the fields, not standing over him with a whip, but actually working beside him. At lunch, the farmer's wife brought sandwiches and lemonade. She smiled at Werner and asked him about his family back home. When Werner told her about his daughter, she went inside and came back with a small wooden toy, a carved horse painted red. She said to send it home to his little girl. Werner held that toy horse and sobbed like a child. This woman, whose country he had been fighting against just months ago, had shown him more kindness than he had experienced in years. She didn't see him as the enemy. She saw him as a father who missed his daughter. By the spring of 1946, word spread through the camps that prisoners would soon be sent back to Germany. Some men cheered and cried with joy. They would finally see their families again, hold their children, sleep in their own beds. But others grew quiet and thoughtful. They had changed during their time in America. They had seen things that couldn't be unseen. They had learned things that couldn't be unlearned. Going home meant returning to a country that no longer existed, not really. Friedrich was among the first groups to be repatriated. He boarded a ship in New York Harbor in June 1946. As the boat pulled away from the dock, he stood on the deck and looked back at the city skyline. Buildings so tall they seemed to scrape the sky itself. Ships and boats filling the harbor like a forest of masts and smokestacks. Even from the water, he could see the wealth and power of this nation that had defeated his homeland so completely. The crossing took 2 weeks, and the entire time Friedrich wondered what he would find when he arrived. The ship docked in Bremen, and Friedrich stepped onto German soil for the first time in over a year. What he saw made his heart sink into his stomach. The port city was still mostly rubble. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened. Buildings stood like broken teeth, walls with no roofs, windows with no glass. Children in rags begged for food near the docks. Old women pulled wooden carts piled with belongings, going nowhere in particular, just surviving another day. He took a train toward Dresden, but the train moved slowly because so many tracks had been destroyed and not yet repaired. The journey that once took 4 hours now took 3 days. Through the train window, Friedrich saw endless destruction. Every city, every town, every village showed scars of war. Burned-out tanks rusted in fields. Crashed planes lay half-buried in farmers' land. Bridges ended in mid-air, going nowhere. When Friedrich finally reached what remained of Dresden, he almost couldn't recognize his own city. The beautiful Baroque buildings were gone. The opera house was a shell. His old neighborhood was a flat field of broken bricks. He found his family living in the basement of a partially collapsed apartment building. His wife Maria was so thin her cheekbones jutted out like knives. His 2 sons, now 7 and 9 years old, stared at him with huge eyes and gaunt faces. They barely remembered him. That first night, Maria made soup from potatoes and a tiny bit of lard. It was watery and tasteless. The boys ate it hungrily, scraping their bowls with their fingers to get every drop. Friedrich tried to eat, but his throat kept closing. He kept thinking about the Thanksgiving feast, about throwing away leftover bread, about Coca-Cola for 5 cents. The contrast was so violent it made him physically sick. He tried to tell Maria about America, about the abundance, about being treated with dignity and kindness. She listened with a hard expression on her face. When he finished, she said quietly, "How can you speak well of the enemy? They destroyed our city. They killed thousands of our people in the firebombing. And you sit here telling me they gave you turkey dinners?" Friedrich had no answer. How could he explain what he had learned? How could he make her understand that their real enemy had been their own government, their own leaders who had led them into this disaster? The city was now controlled by the Soviet military. Red Army soldiers patrolled the streets. People disappeared in the night, arrested for unknown reasons. Friedrich realized he was living in a new kind of prison, one with invisible walls. At night, lying next to his wife in their cold basement, listening to his children cough, he thought about America. He thought about warm barracks and full bellies. He thought about farmers who treated prisoners like human beings. He thought about a system where people could speak freely and choose their own government. But not everyone came home. In camps across America, approximately 9,000 German prisoners made a different choice. Klaus was one of them. He had been assigned to work on a farm in Iowa, and the farmer had offered to sponsor him for immigration. The farmer's son had died in the war fighting in France, and the old man needed help running 300 acres. Klaus could stay, could work legally, could eventually become an American citizen. Werner also chose to stay. He had met a young woman who worked at the camp library, a German-American girl whose grandparents had immigrated before World War I. She brought him books, and they talked for hours about literature and music and life. They fell in love, slowly, carefully. Her family agreed to sponsor him. He wrote to his wife in Germany, a letter that took 3 months to arrive and broke his heart to write. He told her he couldn't come back, that there was no future there, that she should find someone else. He sent money when he could. He never stopped thinking about his daughter, but he also never got on a ship to return. Thousands of others made similar choices. Some married American women. Some were sponsored by farmers and factory owners who valued their skills and work ethic. Some simply looked at the photographs coming from Germany, the rubble, the starvation, the Soviet occupation, and chose to build new lives instead of returning to old ones. Many came from areas that were now controlled by the Russians, and they knew what Soviet labor camps meant. America offered something Germany could not: hope. Years passed. The men who stayed in America built lives. Klaus saved money and eventually bought his own small farm. Werner and his wife had 3 children who grew up speaking English and playing baseball. They celebrated Thanksgiving every year, and Werner always cried a little when the turkey came to the table. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.